value of more than 1,000, you are coming to a risk ratio of even 16. And I looked up it for the positive and negative predictive accuracy of our study. Now remember, it's 5 years, and then you see with more than 1,000 we have a positive predictive accuracy of 12.7, so meaning 25% in 10 years. And that is what I said to you before. It is in the range of defibrillator implantations, so it is from the clinical value very useful and helpful. Now with the encyclopedic study, we did this net reclassification calculation, and this was shown before, just to remember to you that in the intermediate risk group, those below 100 has a risk which is similar and not different to the low risk group, and on the other side, those with a high calcium score have a high event rate which is even higher than in the total high risk group. And therefore we could use this Kuhne publication and edit here the calcium net reclassification improvement, and you see that it is very high, and only one study with the biomarkers came nearly the same range, but particularly HSCRP is not getting this amount of the net improvement. So we looked in our study again to this point of net reclassification. Here the Framingham risk event rates in the different groups, and here you see the event rates for the calcium. It is doubling the event rates, and we have 8% and more in 5 years. And when we now look to, I go back, I think, I'm sorry. Here I go to the high sensitive CRP, and you see what is most important when we look to the different categories which were published before, and you know it is quite distributed over all parts, and you come only to event rate of 4%. And here you see now the ROC curves which you calculated for CRP. Here's the primary risk score first. Here's the primary risk plus the CRP, so minimal non-significant change. Here you see the calcium scoring. The increase is more than 0.05, and when we add the CRP, it's again not significant different concerning just primary and the calcium scoring. The primary risk and the CRP here put together and compared, then there is a small increase when we add calcium to primary risk and CRP. Interesting is when
So that's one of the critics' issue, that here CAC does not add much. Is that significant, that addition?
Yeah, I can go back. You see we have it before here. That is primary risk score, and when we add CRP, it's not significant. And it's a very small, you see, it's just 0.01 improvement of the ROC curves. And here's the calcium, really a significant improvement concerning Framingham. And yeah, and when I add to this high sensitivity, it's not. And important, I think, for judging, when you look to the calcium scoring, we see in each category an increase in risk related to the amount of calcium. But when we look to high sensitive CRP, in the low parts it is true, but here we have a really drop, so it is not as consistent as we see it here for the CRP. And when we look to the net reclassification improvement, really in this study comparing high sensitive CRP and calcium, you see 7.8%, which is not significant, and 20.8 for calcium, highly significant. So this is my final present slide demonstrating the comparison of these two different markers of risk in comparison to what has been published previously in the Kuhne list of references. Thanks.
speak up, we cannot hear.
There's one critical slide that I would like to show because that really
Okay,
matches.
what's your, what computer are you? Was that you?
Let's see. Yeah, I think it's coming.
In the slide you just showed, it looked like there was a greater net reclassification in the 6 to 10 group than there was in the 10 to 20 group.
Yes, yeah.
That's very important.
Yeah, that is what we did also, and really a big step forward when we take the 6 to 20. That's what is in the publication also.
Did you look at the people who had high calcium and high CRP, and is there any step up there?
Yeah. Due to the time constraints, I took it out. Here you see the high calcium in composite 3D. And you see, I think what is interesting to see, that in this low category, there it seems to be as if we have an additional value for the CRP biomarker. So when we have 0 calcium, and there were, as you know, some people who had events, and that relates to the fact that we have to take into account not everything in the cardiovascular events and cardiac events is atherosclerotic event. It may be something different.
This is
Yeah,
what Paul,
Takachuru and so on.
this is what Paul Rickos was trying to tell us in our last SHAPE symposium. He was there to say, why don't you try to combine the two? Now Harvey Hughes stood up and said, no, I don't need CRP or CRP, my CAC is good enough. Now, how do you address this? The synergistic effect of CRP and CAC.
It's not there.
It's not there.
In low, in 0 category it is.
Well, no, it's a very small group, and the problem is, it's exactly divergent from another study. So, DeTrano and Park published data on calcium and CRP, and showed the only place it helped was in the intermediate calcium score, that it didn't help at all in the low calcium score. So if we're going to take spurious results from each trial with small data sets, the conclusion has to be that it's not a consistent finding. Sanjay could go into more, it's unwarranted, whatever. But this is spurious from another study. So we don't have consistent results where CRP and calcium line up. And we need consistent results if we're going to make a recommendation. I'm not saying that calcium or CRP, but if we're going to say they should always be used together, we better have a consistent results. And this is not consistent with other studies, including MESA. So I'm not saying your studies are wrong, I'm just saying this may be spurious based on small
I don't know why you
numbers.
say it's not consistent, because in this one, you have an increase.
I'll show you the Park slide.
Right, Park isn't, but you have,
Totally
I don't know if you've done p-value analysis, see if these are observational or just meaningful. But there is a slight
Is there an
increase here.
interaction p-value? Interaction?
Interaction p-values.
Not by mind, I have to check it in the paper.
But there, I see,
can tell you later, I have to see.
I see there is a trend for increase. Why don't you see that? I mean, you don't see that?
Of course, you will see here from 3.57 to 5.9,
Right.
2.09 to
There you
3.1,
go.
1 to 4.6,
Right, and then 10 to 14. So it's there is a
Some more
consistency.
We have calculated, I don't, but
Yeah, you need
I'm not
to
on
Okay, just
Totally different.
connect yours. Well, we're going to discuss that.
I'm just saying, but this is the problem.
This is the part of the SHAPE guideline update this morning we forgot. We talked about the ABI. We were going to talk about the CRP because CRP was optional in SHAPE 1. We're going to finalize SHAPE guideline tomorrow, but I think it's important to accept that this, is this yours?
No.
Mark, while they're bringing up the slide, is there any evidence to suggest that you can use CRP as your first filter for the decision to add CAC or IMP?
No, we have evidence that if you put just CRP, you leave out a lot of people with disease, meaning with plaque, that have low CRP. We have evidence on that. Therefore, we came up in SHAPE 1 that if you have an intermediate or moderately high risk and you have high CRP, you can push them to high risk. So that was the role of CRP in SHAPE 1. Now we're discussing what can we do with SHAPE 2. I think this is something that we need to address. How can CRP and where add value to CAC. And its concept is that CAC is the disease, the structure of disease, not the activity of disease. Maybe high CRP shows that the disease is more active, and that's the concept that we need to.
Wasn't there a study, I forget the name, Sika or something, but that Dan Rader was involved in, where he looked at CRP and CAC, and he demonstrated that CAC correlated better with disease and CRP correlated better with events? Is there any,
I don't remember such a study. This is the only study, I remember the very first study.
This is Circulation 2002. Bob Detrono's, well, yeah, but except the only place that there was a statistical benefit, there was no overall statistical benefit in adding CRP to calcium in the study. The p-value was less than was greater than 0.05. But the only place that he concluded that it may be helpful, and this is Paul Rittger uses this slide, is medium calcium scores, which is exactly different than what we just saw, where the only place it added value was a score of 0.
Okay, let's look at his data.
So I'm just saying, if we look at those back and forth,
let's
they're
look
different.
at, well, I think you, over there, you show a trend. Here,
But
we
here there's
see
no
a
trend at all. This is the same
No,
data
no,
set.
no. There is a consistent trend through all categories, that there is lower going to higher. Whether you have enough sample size to see. If you had a large sample size, and this was the same in the large sample size, I would bet that would be significant statistically. Now, we don't have enough sample size. So did you just show another slide like this?
That's a cumulative event rate. That's not.
Event rate doesn't show added value. Okay, I think that question will remain, and since tomorrow morning we're going to draw the final conclusion on the guideline change. I'd like to do some more work tonight, and everybody who's got some reference. So we addressed it, because we addressed the API, we haven't addressed this data.
Just want to show you some unpublished data about CRP.
Okay, and you're number 6?
I think, and so does Howard,
Is that yours?
CRP is about inflamed plaques. It's about the burden of inflamed plaques.
We don't agree with you. We think
doesn't
CRP comes from all other areas as well. It's not just from inflamed plaque.
Well, you didn't say it was just, you said it was more inside.
And if you look at multiple regression, C-reactive protein does not predict plaque area, and it doesn't predict stenosis independently. Whereas for LP-A, what you see is that LP-A doesn't predict plaque, but it significantly predicts stenosis and occlusion, because it's a clotting factor.
Right. I think what we're talking about, and we changed it very cleverly, that this, Paul Ritzker also says that it is not a mediator in the process of atherosclerosis or atherothrombosis. It's a marker. But if it's a good marker, cheap marker, widely available, that's his sales. But point is, if there is any added value with feedback CRP, I mean CRP can add any value to IMT, plaque, volume, or coronary calcium. And if there is, why not using it?
Well, more, as a dispassionate observer, I would rather use a marker that does not involve any exposure to any issues that have to deal with safety, for example, radiation safety, and which is relatively inexpensive and can be readily measured. As a dispassionate, I have no.
Well, you're calling for IMT. You're talking for.
I'm sorry.
Now you're basically doing this, the carotid plaque volume and IMT cells. That's what you're doing now. But the point is.
But that's what I'm saying. That if you could somehow refine the guidelines, the shape guidelines, where you minimize the use of a tool that comes with some additional baggage despite its better performance. I think that would be better received.
Let's see the testing system. Okay.
Whether that's CRP or some other magical marker, we don't know what it is. But from a non-scientific argument, it will be better received.
Politically, it's socially accepted. Is that what you're?
There you go.
Okay, so this is the data from cardiovascular study, which as you know is the study done in the elderly, the cardiovascular studies in more than 70
microphone is not.
5,000,
Sorry.
so about 5,000
No,
patients.
we can't hear.
Okay, 5,000 patients. So now they're looking at the interaction of C-reactive protein with carotid IMT. I just pulled it up from the internet. And basically, I just want to show you this table here, right there. So they are basically looking at the different quartiles by CRP concentration. And then here is the odds ratio, which is unadjusted. This is the odds ratio for predicting risk after adjusting for the Framingham risk, the age, the gender, the blood pressure, and so on. And it still remains significant, progressively so. And then this is the model adjusting for, remember this study used the ICA and the CCA IMT only, they did not look at plaque, they did not look at bulb, so there are limitations. But now they're adjusting for ICA IMT and there is kind of a progressive increment in odds ratio. Here they're adjusting for CCA IMT, and then here they're adjusting for combined IMT, and in the highest quartile, you have an odds ratio of 1.49 for CRP, for stroke.
That's interesting. It's adjusted for other risk factors?
Is this?
Incremental value of CRP over IMT.
Correct. Yes.
That's good for IMT. Do we have something like that for CAC?
And then I wanted to show you this slide, which is the data derived from Eric's study. No, it does not look at CRP, but just to give you the NRI, the clinical NRI of the risk factors alone versus risk factors plus IMT plus plaque. Clinical NRI is in patients who are intermediate risk. So overall, your NRI percentage is 27 including the CIMT and plaque in the Eric data. And again, Eric has limitation because they did not look at near wall, so any plaque in the near wall would have been missed.
So there are 5 outcome studies looking at calcium plus CRP, and in all 5 studies, calcium is an independent predictor of events, and CRP is not.
But the CRP does not add
CRP always attenuates out of the equation in every study ever published. Every study. So,
including Mesa.
including Mesa. You said the relative risk of CRP was 1.0. 1.0. That was it. In the Mesa, in the New England Journal of Medicine, the CRP was higher among non-events than events. In New England Journal of Medicine in 2008, the CRP was higher in the patients who did not have an event overall in Mesa as compared to those who had an event.
Why didn't Mesa publish CRP?
Because Mary Cushman, who's the PI of this and wrote the original paper proposal, does not want to publish the CRP data until more time has passed to see if CRP becomes predictive. It's been 8 years. I'm not sure when that time will come, but so far, she has not wanted to present that data. But it's in New England Journal of Medicine. Bob Detrono's paper, CRP values are lower among the event population.
You know,
I don't know how to reconcile it.
Can we
I don't know how to reconcile
can we
it at all.
analyze that?
There's
Why?
no-
the study that I was quoting is called CIRCA, the study of inherited risk of coronary atherosclerosis. Riley was the first author.
Right, there's no events. It's not an event trial.
No, that was not an event. Well, actually, in CIRCA, CRP was not associated with CAC in men, and the weak association in women was lost after adjustment for BMI.
Right, but there was no events. That was just calcium versus
Right.
CRP.
Basically, then they proposed that CRP may associate with events, CAC may associate with disease, and so that was the theory in 2003,
Right.
not being borne out.
They said so that paper, I wrote an editorial that got published about that paper.
ATVB, right.
Right, so that paper said that because CRP is well borne out as a risk factor, and because calcium doesn't correlate well with CRP, that CRP is correct and calcium is spurious. That was basically their conclusion. So I wrote an editorial saying that calcium plus CRP probably makes sense, that hypertension predicts events and diabetes predicts events, but just because hypertension doesn't always predict diabetes doesn't mean that they're not both predictive of events. So I wrote an editorial saying that calcium plus CRP, disease plus inflammation, would possibly be predictive. I've been wrong. No, I'm wrong. Five outcome studies in a row show calcium predicts events and CRP does not. When in the same model. When in the same
Well, he
model.
has the data. Is that the same study? Okay.
Yeah, here you see.
Sanjay, this is the study, Sanjay.
Yeah, here you see our. I'm sorry that I picked it.
Okay.
Just a moment.
Right.
Here. Here you see those with events and without events, the calcium scoring, family score. Yes, I increase. So. And you see that the median CRP was 1.4 in those without events and 2.1 in those with events, highly significant. And you see that also the distribution was different in those with events and without events. More than 3 was here, 22% without events and 40.7 with events. And then we did a multi-variable logistic regression analysis, including also, I think that's important, the presence of cardiovascular medicine, so lipid-lowering drugs. And here you see for high sensitive CRP, it is 1.09, which is significant, not very strong. Calcium 1.39, highly significant. Primary score 1.03. So it is in this respect predictive for coronary events.
Fermium risk score independently
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
model?
Yeah.
But you didn't put them all together. Is calcium and CRP in the same model?
No.
No, they're not in the same model, because it would fall out. It always falls out. No, so Raymond, the question is, if you put calcium and CRP in the same model, does CRP still have predictive power? And so far, 5 papers have said no, that CRP falls out as an independent predictor. You're down to 1.09 without adding calcium into your model. I don't know what the result will be, but it looks like with a range of 1.01 to 1.39, you're already pretty borderline. You're probably going to lose predictability, and you'll be the 6th study. Right, that's what I'm saying. So you might lose that. You might be the same as other studies.
Okay.
One comment here. I think we should remember a study that is ancient, and I can't remember the exact. Was it the British Heart Study? It was the one in which they had 20,000 patients, and they treated them with simvastatin versus placebo, I think. Heart protection study. I'm sorry, heart protection study. And the big lesson from that was that it didn't matter what your LDL was. Whether LDL was high, whether it was 70, you had exactly the same improvement in outcome. And so we're talking about LDL with an odds ratio of maybe 1.3. There's no reason to think any other biomarker with an odds ratio of only 1.3 would be any better.
Okay, I'm going to stop everybody here. Go get your coffee and cookies. Come back here sooner than later.
I used to check plug in my stuff with my juice going.
Thanks to Monique and Jeff Stein and many others. Pick your size. Medium, I think large, there shouldn't be any extra large here in shape. Before you sit, just go ahead and get your
Can we wear this? I think people will be dead.
This illustration showing that at the top we have a structural assessment of the disease, at the bottom the functional assessment of the disease. But we really never had anything added to shape because none of these functional measures had enough data to be comparable to structural measurement. Here 5 years later, to my limited knowledge, we still don't have any of those escalated to the level of chloride iron, theophylline, and calcium. But we're going to go and discuss them and see where they are and if the car is going to walk us through.
Thank you, Mark.
to me. Here it is.
All right, so we made the case for assessing arterial function and not just blood pressure in this paper in 2007, based on the premise that vascular risk factors, be they conventional, novel, or genetic, essentially have this pathway where they affect function or structure of the arterial wall, and that would manifest as endothelial dysfunction, arterial stiffening, or intermediate thickening. These would lead to non-obstructive plaque, and the behavior of this plaque may also be influenced by these functional manifestations, leading to either chronic ischemic syndromes or acute cardiovascular events. I think the history of this is quite fascinating because in the 19th century, there was an enormous interest in looking at the pulse characteristics. And people actually made quite some attempts at some very interesting devices, including this one here called a sphygmograph. And they clearly were able to see the difference in pulse characteristics between young and old. But unfortunately, what happened was that this sphygmomanometer came along based on actuarial data that people who had high blood pressure did not do very well. And then the sphygmomanometer took over, and we've been with it over the last more than 100 years. But the assessment of waveforms and other characteristics kind of fell by the wayside and has had some resurgence recently. So the point here is that you might want to assess arterial function and structure in these three domains: stiffness, endothelial function, and structural changes, say in the carotid artery in terms of intermediate thickness or plaque. And the way, and I'll start with tonometry, and tonometry allows you to assess stiffness and wave reflection. And just a very brief introduction to this concept of the arteries as not just conduits, but also capacitance vessels. And so if you see on the left, this would be at the bottom you can see the pulse characteristics. If the arteries were just conduits, you would have flow during systole, cessation during diastole. But actually the aorta functions as a reservoir and releases flow or blood during diastole. And as a result, you have pulsatile flow and perfusion, which is necessary for life. And these characteristics can be easily non-invasively assessed by tonometry. And the principle is simple. You can applanate an artery where it's running over a bone. Typically, there's a high fidelity manometer fixed in this instrument. This is a pen-like instrument. And what you do is you partially flatten, do not obliterate the artery, and the pulse characteristics are transmitted to an instrument and then displayed. And these waveforms actually can be as good as the ones you obtain if you put a catheter into the artery. So you don't have to do that. There are many ways to measure stiffness, but pulse wave velocity across the segment is probably the gold standard. And the artery of greatest interest, of course, is the aorta, because that's what changes with risk factors in age. And you can see that the pulse wave velocity is actually a direct measure of an inherent stiffness property of the wall of the artery called the Young's modulus. There are some other factors that influence it, including the wall thickness, arterial radius, and blood viscosity, but you can see with this formula that it's a direct measure of arterial stiffness. And it's measured simply by having an ECG in place, and you measure the waveform at the carotid. And then you don't have to measure both together. You can then go over to the groin, and you can measure the femoral. And because the femoral is a little bit further away from the heart, there's a little bit of a latency here in the upstroke of the two waveforms. You measure this distance physically by a tape measure, not ideal, but the best you can do. And then you measure this time interval because of the ECG gating. You have distance, you have time, and you get velocity. Now, This measure has been shown, I'll show that in the next slide, to be associated with a diverse range of cardiovascular outcomes, including death and adverse cardiovascular events, and heart attack, as well as stroke and atrial fibrillation. In this study in 2006, we showed actually that it was very nicely correlated with the presence of coronary artery calcification. And so one of the mechanisms by which it might be related is through its association with subclinical coronary atherosclerosis, but there are other modalities or mechanisms or pathways through which pulse wave velocity may give us information about cardiovascular risk. There are many studies now, and this is Mort's point, that since the last shape, I think there's been at least 3 or 4 community-based studies that have shown similar results to the one on this slide. So I'm just showing this particular study from the Framingham. This is also the latest one, in fact, just a few months old. And let me walk you through it. This is the Framingham offspring study, 2,200 individuals, mean age 63, followed up for 7.5 years, events 150. And then these are the survival associated with, or actually probability of cardiovascular events on the y-axis associated with increasing pulse wave velocity. This is 7.7, and the highest quartile is greater than 11 meters per second. And this was associated with a hazard ratio of nearly 50% higher for one standard deviation increase in pulse wave velocity. And a standard deviation is typically about 3 meters per second. So every meter per second is associated with a 10% increase in risk of this composite set of events, which included MI, angina, stroke, and death. This is independent of everything else: age, sex, diabetes, smoking, cholesterol. And this has been replicated in 2 community-based studies from Europe, and also in the Strong Heart study. So independent predictor of cardiovascular outcomes. It's also nicely correlated with aging, chronological age. And obviously, if you want a good marker of biological age, you don't want it to correspond exactly to age, but you need to have some variation. And you can see that in healthy young adults, the value is about 5 meters per second, and as we age, it doubles. If we don't age very well, it triples. So, there are factors that determine that slope, whether it's genetics or other risk factors. So you have some people that reach 20 meters per second. But this could be also used as a very nice index of biological aging and substituted into the conventional risk factor algorithm, as was earlier pointed out. So the next modality would be ultrasound, and we've already heard much about IMT and plaque, so I'm just going to focus on endothelial function. And the commonest modality studied is brachial reactivity. You measure the brachial artery diameter at rest, and then you cause ischemia in the forearm for 5 minutes, and then you release the cuff, and there's a hyperemic surge of blood. If the endothelium is healthy, it recognizes that surge, and in order to accommodate that increased flow, there's nitric oxide release, the brachial artery diameter increases, typically by about 10% in a healthy young individual. This looks easy on this picture, but it's actually technically difficult to do to minimize with greater reproducibility. So that's a limitation of this particular means of assessing endothelial function. But this is the one that has the most data. And here's one such study from MESA. Again, this is MESA this is a subset of MESA individuals, about 3,000 patients. 61 is the mean age, followed up for 5 years. The number of events was 182. And the hazard ratio for one standard deviation increase in brachial reactivity was 0.84. So there was a 16% reduction if your endothelial function was better. Overall, a very modest association, and at this point, it doesn't seem like clinically it's going to be tremendously helpful. Just like calcification in one place, the amount and so forth, there is data that other information obtained from this test, including just simply brachial diameter, or how much hyperemic flow there is, may have also prognostic information, but that hasn't been demonstrated yet. So this is an algorithm we had proposed back 2 years back, that if an asymptomatic individual, you do the office-based evaluation, calculate the 10-year probability of coronary heart disease. If the individual is intermediate, then you use arterial function and structure by ultrasound and tonometry. Again, this is relatively inexpensive, free of radiation. If the patient is not an intermediate or low risk, but has any of the following: family history, metabolic syndrome, substantially elevated single risk factor like a very high LDL, certain novel risk factor like LPA or chronic renal insufficiency, you may also want to consider this. And then if you had abnormalities, you could make the case for earlier treatment or more aggressive treatment. So I guess the concept here would be to study arterial health, which sometimes is quite appealing to individuals. And it would consist of aortic pulse rate velocity, brachial artery flow-mediated dilatation, and carotid IMT. Right now, the weak link in this is the brachial artery FMD, and there's the need for a more reproducible form of endothelial function assessment. I didn't discuss this, but there's also other proponents of pulse wave reflection and central blood pressure. There's some data that blood pressure measures centrally may actually be a better indicator of long-term cardiovascular risk than the one we measured at the brachial in the arm. But the best data is for pulse wave velocity. So we still need more data, obviously, AP prospective studies to establish that assessment of arterial structure and function improves outcomes. That holds true for many of the things we discussed today. We need more data in diverse ethnic groups. And importantly, we need standardized methods, QC, accreditation of the people who perform these tests, and also need some information about reimbursement. So I'm going to stop here and be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I have that question that I actually circulated as a slide. In shape 1, we had Jay Cohen, part of our team, and he was very much pushing his technology, which was C1, C2, CV profile. And then we saw this I'm going to try to bring this up, this poster presented at the ACC, which shows the Framingham study that you just showed did not have superior predictive value over coronary calcium or carotid IMT. Those two were not in the model. It was just pulse width velocity. Yeah. Is that right?
That's correct.
Well, here he claims that in MESA, once you adjust for coronary calcium, again, he's not here, but let's see, I'm Jay Cohen, and I'm really badly wanting to sell this device.
Right.
And so, what is our answer to him? He says these are asymptomatic population, baseline MESA. We measure C1, C2, and here is the superior predictive value, and CAC and IMT both were into the model and were not predictive, and C1, C2 was predictive. So the conclusion in asymptomatic subjects, free, let me just break it down so you can see it like this. So this is coming under the functional category, and it is adjusted for coronary calcium and carotid. It is for prediction of CHF events. And he says carotid IMT and coronary calcium were not predicted. We know that carotid IMT and coronary calcium are atherosclerosis markers. They are not hypertensive cardiomyopathy markers. But from the public health point of view, is there any value of looking at this?
Well, I think there's a great interest in different modalities of arterial stiffness assessment. So there's basically three that are existing. One is assessing the systolic waveform parameters, and that includes augmentation and wave reflection. The other is what Jay proposes. It's looking at the diastolic part of it and how it decays, and he has some algorithms that he thinks that the way that decays gives you an assessment of peripheral resistance and endothelial function. And the third one is this pulse wave velocity, which is essentially looking at just the aorta.
Okay.
And the data is certainly, whatever is published and peer reviewed, is the strongest for pulse wave velocity. It's weaker for central blood pressure augmentation index. And, I think data like this needs to come out if he wants to make a case. This is not
Because
peer
this is
reviewed,
the
I don't
very
know.
first independent, non-J. Cohen-sponsored data that I have known. Because everything else I've seen from Mesa.
This is from Mesa?
This is from Mesa.
And what is LAE and SAE?
These are his definition of arterial dysfunction based on large conduit and small artery. So here, elasticity index, right?
LAE?
Large,
Oh, I see, yeah.
Large arterial elasticity.
And this is not from J. Cohen? This is independent Mesa?
No, this is Mesa, but it is
His device?
This is his device, and people who are associated with, I know they're associated with Jay as well, but it is not Jay Cohen's own database, so I think there is value here. That we
Well, I mean, obviously, it's still not fully peer-reviewed, and,
yes,
we
that's
had to
another-
wait
yeah.
it, but
unless they manipulated data and create something like this is Mesa data. This is based on.
The number of heart failure events in MACE is small.
Well, no,
compared
look
to
at
MI.
that. It's as many as MI. It's look, it's 180 or 18. Where is that?
Well, this makes sense. I've got a lot of experience with the Singapore device. And
this is a different device.
it's a little, right, it's a little different device, but I'm saying it makes sense. It makes sense that an index of an essentially left ventricular ejection and dynamics as far as afterload, which is really part of the dynamics of a Sigma core device, it makes sense that that would be more predictive of heart failure than coronary events. I mean, this is not atherosclerosis mediated.
Right.
And in fact, CIMT, and I think Erling has told us about this, CIMT itself is more a reflection of hemodynamics than atherosclerosis. It's the plaque that's more atherosclerosis, but the actual, after you get rid of those foam cells, it's mostly, right, it's hypertension.
Yeah, media is very dynamic because it's dependent on blood pressure in IMT.
Right. So I'm just saying that coronary calcium is a reflection of atherosclerosis, which ultimately could lead to heart failure via having an MI. But
I agree. I assume that
it
you
doesn't
were talking
surprise me
about...
that any sort of thing that looks at arterial stiffness would be more directly to heart failure than coronary calcium.
I think it depends on what the outcome was, and was it a composite and how much CHF contributed, or is it exclusively CHF?
This is exclusively CHF.
Okay, now that's a different discussion.
Right,
Because I thought you were talking about athero, and I was
No. I
thinking
said that
about-
we discussed this morning, and PK, I think echoed what Matt tried to push, that really we want to stay focused. But I'm just raising this point because it relates to your functional assessment. This is a pure functional assessment.
Exactly.
And when coronary calcium and carotid went to the model, these people had, of course, these people could, first thing I'd like to know if this is independent of blood pressure, which looks like he's saying it's independent. So if it is independent of blood pressure, independent of carotid and coronary calcium, it's a great thing. But if it is not independent of blood pressure, and blood pressure is on the side, that would be ridiculous because you just measure blood pressure. Why do you need to go through all this? So I'll send this to you.
Sure.
Because we're going to discuss this further. Tasneem?
There is a point. So I have a tremendous experience with using Sigma core device. I've used it actually since 2005, I think. But I use it for a completely different reason. I'm using it for pacemaker optimization in heart failure population. But I kind of know the device. I've looked into the reimbursement and all aspects of it. So first of all, there is an inbuilt quality control incorporated within the Sigma core device. So if you have a standard deviation which is more than 3, then you should not take those readings.
That's right.
2, they have actually got a code, a reimbursement code that I think gives you $30 or something for each time you use it to assess cardiovascular function or something. That's what it is approved for. And then there are actually studies, so this one is not peer reviewed yet, but there is actually a study, the Strong Heart study that you were referring to, where they compared this particular device against carotid IMT and plaques, and found that it is a better predictor of events compared to any other measure, including, can I just put this on?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, so this is what I was referring to.
Central pressure.
That's central pressure.
Yeah.
But with the same device,
Yes.
you measure arterial stiffness and central
That's a great point. So my wish list is put a carotid 3D probe here and measure carotid IMT, measure plaque, measure volume base and plaque characterization, and measure some functional parameters like elasticity, like waveform analysis, like central pressure. From your expert point of view, functional expert point of view, is this a dream or it's possible?
I would actually agree with that. I think we need data though, but I think the concept is wonderful because you can do this quickly, non-invasively. There's no radiation. It gives you an orthogonal view to the structure part, right? It's not the same information. It's a different angle.
That's right.
So I think that the concept is beautiful. We need more data to see whether it's incremental or just doing the carotid IMT is enough. But I think this would give you more information about heart failure, atrial fibrillation, and total mortality. And the other would give you more about MI and
it can be done in less than 5 minutes. It's
I mean,
actually
if you-
easier than anti-gradient.
If you, I mean, what Henrik said, it's a 3D device, you just put it here, it gets all the data. As part of the data is obtained, it's waveform analysis, elasticity, and central pressure. You just need to measure brachial pressure, and then it calculates it. It's a one-time job, it doesn't change your procedures, and here you are with structural and functional data accumulated. But we have to show if they're adding anything to each other.
right. And it's not that you can't do anything about these things. Central blood pressure can be differentially treated with ACE inhibitors. Stiffness can be treated with lifestyle and drugs as well. So I think it's a very nice concept that we need to study further. It doesn't have the radiation aspect of it. And I think we need to think beyond blood pressure, which we've been using for the last 110 years. It's very, of course, it's essentially zero, and you get a lot of good information, but I think we need to move beyond that, and this is a step in that direction.
Mort, in centers that I had that did coronary calcium mainly, we used the SphygmoCor device in a complementary way. I looked at the coronary calcium burden in somebody who has a score of 800 or something as sort of old news. Then you treat them, and you want to look at their vascular health, and that will improve. You'll see improvements over a short period of time with both endothelial function testing we're doing and arterial stiffness. Whereas a coronary calcium, we hope it stabilizes, but we don't. So we're able to say to somebody that, that you have had a lot of atherosclerosis, but going forward, we can see an effect of the therapy using these. So we use it in a different way to really look at the new news,
Well,
which
would
is
it be
vascular
great
health.
if you could get them all from one device and it gives you
Oh, yeah.
functional as well as the structural data? That's my wish. Let's go with a whole new angle.
Can I sit here and click the clip?
Yeah, sure.
Is there a microphone over there?
This is the click.
Yeah, I think there is. Good. Thank you very much. And we'll check the time so we stay on time. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about genetic tests and how they might relate to SHAPE 2. Disclosures, I work for Celera now, which is the genetic company that decoded the human genome in 2001 along with the NIH. Some of the things I'll talk about, like KIF6, LPA, are made by Celera. They also are the biggest producers of genetic HIV testing, Fragile X, all that kind of stuff. I still have academic things, a nonprofit, and I have absolutely no relationship whatsoever with pharmaceutical companies or device companies. So genetic tests might complement what we're here talking about today, because one, they identify a high-risk group. They might improve the risk-benefit issue of the radiation we were talking about earlier, but when the radiation gets so low, as we heard, that might be a less benefit. CT screening of family members based on genetic tests might increase the yield, and treatment decisions, if the CD is positive, can be improved upon by simple genetic tests. So the family history issue, we've talked about briefly. Here's a paper that Matt was involved in, simply showing from MESA data that if you ask the question about family history, you increase the yield in terms of positive CAC scores. And there's a very recent one that just came out a few months ago that has to do with asking family history in a more detailed way. So the question here was, should I just say anybody with a coronary event below the age of 55, that's a positive family history? Or should I ask about uncles and aunts? Or should I ask about whether or not they had a coronary event at the age of 62? So more detailed family history is Model 3. And Model 3 really helps discriminate. So if shape 2 comes out and says we think family history is important, I would suggest that it be a more refined family history questionnaire other than just have you had a coronary event less than 55 years of age. That's the importance of this one. Genetics can fit into this model. We're doing a family heart disease study in Atlanta right now, looking at the transmission of these cardiovascular traits within first-degree relatives of some people going through the cath lab, and that might be a concept that rolls into the shape 2 recommendations as well. So the advantage of genetic tests, they're incredibly accurate. So the laboratory aspects of this now are very well worked out. You basically do not make a mistake if you have a good lab. They're once-in-your-lifetime tests. You don't have to keep repeating them over and over. The costs are plummeting because of advances in technology. And you can easily subset large populations into higher or lower risk groups with this very simple test that can be done on cheek swabs now. It helps in making therapeutic decisions, as we'll see. It can dramatically improve the number needed to treat, which I'll show you. It goes way beyond what we've seen today. There's family member implications and the special groups that I mentioned. We strongly believe that there's a need for medical oversight, and direct-to-consumer selling is the wrong thing to do. The disadvantage is that it's a dichotomous test. It's black or white, you got it or you don't have it, as opposed to continuous variables like CT score and other things. There are ethnic differences that have to be considered. Interpretation of results can be different from different individuals to different individuals. Privacy concerns are always there, but the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act was signed by Bush before he left office, and there are always cost concerns, of course. So this just came out a couple days ago, where the FDA is zeroing in on Decode and 23andMe and that sort of thing, because it's not because they're doing the testing correctly, it's because the information they're giving back to the consumer varies. In other words, with the exact same test, one woman was told that she had a above average risk, a medium risk, or below average risk with the exact same DNA profile. So that's why we think that a physician absolutely has to be involved in this, and direct consumer advertising has some major problems. So when you combine genetic tests with non-invasive imaging in the primary prevention population, I'm going to mention 9p21, and then I'm going to mention risk-benefit ratio, and quickly go over the radiation thing, which I thought was important, but it's becoming less important. So in 2007, Bob Roberts at Ottawa and the Decode group announced at the same time that through genome-wide association studies, they found something that's powerfully linked to cardiovascular risk. It's called 9p21, because it's on chromosome number 9, the short arm of chromosome number 9. This is just an analysis of chromosomes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going off to your right, and there's 9p21 sticking its head up. So this was discovered with no hypotheses whatsoever, except that we think some people have heart disease. We're going to look and see if we can find anything through genome-wide association studies, because we have all this technology, and the candidate gene approach had failed. So this is the two initial reports in 2007, Ruth McPherson with Bob Roberts up in Ottawa, and the Decode group, essentially showing the same thing, very good studies, very large populations, repeated the samples, independent sample sets, so it fulfills all the things that are important. About 20 to 25% of the Caucasian population are homozygotes, about 50% are heterozygous. So if you test for this, it's going to light up about 75% of the people you see. However, it does have powerful population prediction for premature coronary disease or early onset coronary disease or heart attacks, for AAA, and for long-term coronary disease. A couple interesting things: it's in no annotated region of the genome, so it's not linked to any specific gene. Bob thinks now it has a lot to do with andrails or messenger RNA non-coding regions of RNA. The mechanism's being worked out, but we really don't know what it codes for or what kind of therapy to have. So this is important for large populations. It explains a large part of the population attributable risk because it's so common, but it has small to moderate individual risk. So that's an important thing to consider. Nevertheless, it's extraordinarily well accepted among the genetic community. So here's a series of studies. Over on the left of the heterozygotes, over on the right of the homozygotes. All the lines are to the right of the line of unity. But the reason I made this slide is the statistics of whether or not this is associated with cardiovascular disease has 60 zeros after P. So now, statistics in genetics is different than normal genetics.
So can you tell us in comparison to CRP and cholesterol is
Yeah.
maybe 1.3, 1.2?
Yeah, well, the point here is that there's no argument of that 9p21 is associated with cardiovascular risk. The issue is how does it fit into practical clinical medicine when it's so common? And I think that's in part been answered recently. This was the thing about radiation. I'll pass by this, but if radiation is an issue, then separating a population who might benefit more from the discovery of coronary calcium from one that might find it less would be useful, because the risk-benefit of exposure to radiation would be improved. But with the levels you saw today, that's kind of a negative argument. This just came out. It was online on July 26th. It's Bob's most recent paper, but it shows a significant link between the homozygous state, 25% of the population, and triple vessel disease. So one could make the argument that this is a useful thing to do for two things. Number one is risk prediction, but number two is in individuals who you've discovered coronary disease in, what's the likelihood that they have really severe coronary disease, such as triple vessel disease. So combining something like this with CAC scoring or other non-invasive imaging tools might refine the data you're making to be of more clinical utility to the physician and help subset people into higher or lower risk categories.
Is there any data on interaction, like CRP
With
that we
CAC?
had just discussed? Is there any data?
No, I don't have any knowledge on interaction of 9p21 and CRP. Does anybody else?
Yeah, well, any database exists that have these two measurements?
Well, we're actually looking at the Jupiter data right now, so that the lab work's been done, the statisticians are cranking on it, so we should be able to comment on that.
Well, Jupiter doesn't have CHC.
Oh, CRP, I said CRP.
No, I'm saying
Okay.
added
Yeah.
value of 9p21 over a structural measurement of atherosclerosis, either CRP or CAC or CIMT.
Yes, no, I don't know of any at the present time. We have data in our firefighter study, but there's only 300 people in that. It's a different study. So looking at it in MESA would be of great interest.
So you would just get blood sample from MESA and run this?
Yeah, what the lab part of this is the easiest thing of all. It's the statistics that are, that take a little bit of time. But yes, that once you're in the lab, you can do it in a matter of days.
The HRP study already? You have this in the HRP study?
We can do it.
You can do
Yeah,
it.
we can do it. We have collected materials. We can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not all that difficult.
Do you anticipate any improvement? I mean, you saw CRP struggling, you couldn't make it.
Yeah. Again, this is a dichotomous thing, and CRP, you break up into quartiles and things if you want. But yes, I think there would be improvement, particularly when you look at the homozygous state, and now that we have the data that Bob just published about triple vessel disease.
Did the Samani paper in New England Journal of Medicine not look at the role of adding CRP on CST and then adding the 9p21? I have the slide here, but I'm not quite sure if this is the same reference. The area under the curve was 0.78 for CHD risk, and when you add CRP, it increases the area under the curve by 0.002, which is not significant. But when you add 9p21, it increases it by 0.004, and it's statistically significant.
But it did look at CRP plus the...
So you didn't look at the incremental, you just looked at independent relative
of the
performance
19
of it. I think the point that you made about the 60 zeros is a good one, because the types of, if you look at it from a methodological point of view, you're basically letting the genome talk, independent of any supposition or bias. So it's sort of antithetical to our hypothetical framework of scientific inquiry. But there's a problem with that framework. One is that because if you're evaluating up to 500,000 gene polymorphisms, just imagine how many permutations and combinations you're going to get.
Right.
And so p-values should be dismissed in these types of analyses, because I would say that you will get at least 10,000 or 100,000 comparisons that will be statistically significant.
But these are corrected for...
Yeah, you do all these Bonferroni corrections
Yeah,
and
but
things,
it's just the point I'm still making is that it's driven without a hypothesis, and it's driven by so many permutations and combinations that one has to be very careful about that.
I totally agree with you. There's a thing in the field now called worshiping at the altar of GWAS, and so it's the latest thing. Everyone's getting on board. So, but yeah, I would be very cautious. But it is fascinating that the candidate gene approach found almost nothing. And now GWAS is popping up all these things, but all it is an indication of the potential or probability. It doesn't necessarily have a physiologic role, unless you can explain an enzyme or something that's doing something.
We can't find any biological plausibility whatsoever.
Oh, and rails.
This is the real deal, Sanjay. This is not the.
No, when you look at the strength of association, it's very modest, 1.4 to 2.
No. This is not just the strength of association, it's replication. Replication not once, but an infinitum. It's been replicated 20 times. This is the real deal.
No one argues with
this. This is not the crap that we were
No, I'm not saying that. I mean, replication is at the heart of scientific inquiry. Nobody's arguing that. But the point I'm saying is that the strength of association,
well, the problem
if we present data with p-values of 60 zeros after the decimal, can be misleading. The strength
but
of
you can look at
association
it through the odds ratio. You don't have to look at the p-values. The p-values are meaningless.
The better attribute of GWAS performance is what I call population attributable risk. And it's 21% for MI, and I think 31% for patients with history of CSD or something like that.
That's very significant. I mean,
And that is a decent number.
Yes. A significant number, and because